Welcome back to BLOCKTV and Crypto Globe. It has been a week since Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook strongman and Libra dreamer, took the stand on the Hill to face a firing squad in the form of the U.S. House Committee on Financial Services. He withstood 6 hours of questioning in which many of Washington's grievances about the social network were laid bare. Very little, one can argue, of the substance of that hearing actually dealt with Libra and the idea behind it. But love or hate Mark Zuckerberg, one warning he gave on that congressional witness stand, so to speak, took less than a week to come true. Let's have a listen.
Mr. Zuckerberg, what other countries, primarily China, are doing in the digital currency space?
Congressman, I think right now, especially related to Libra and this idea, Chinese companies would be the primary competitors. It's, there is an ongoing public-private partnership in China where they're very focused on building this and exporting it around the world, which I know that there are a lot of questions that are, I think, are completely valid questions about how a project like this would impact America's financial leadership, our ability to impose sanctions around the world, our oversight of the financial system in a lot of places. I just think that we need to trade off and think about and weigh any risks of a new system against what I think are surely risks if a Chinese financial system becomes the standard in more countries, because then it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for us to impose our sanctions or the kinds of protections that I think we're right to want to have oversight around the world on all of these different countries, and that's something that I worry about.
On the first page of your testimony, you state we face a lot of issues over the past few years, and I'm sure people wish it was anyone but Facebook. I appreciate
Several days after Mark Zuckerberg warned on that stand, so to speak, against the impending race, China's president came out praising blockchain as a decree, and the People's Republic even passed its first crypto law. Now, we can't help but wonder if in Washington, D.C., legislators are beginning to understand the race. But luckily for us, we have an insider joining us now from Washington, D.C., Parian Boring, president and founder of the Chamber of Digital Commerce, who was in that hearing last week, but above all is spearheading the good fight, as I would like to call it, of actually educating people in the Capitol. First of all, Parian, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Okay. To begin with, I want to start, though, with some fresh news. It's been a week since that Zuckerberg Hill appearance. We'll touch on everything that happened last week as well. But since then, the president of China moved ahead with what can only be described as a new national blockchain agenda. Because you are based in Washington, because you know the ins and outs, are there any reactions? Was there any reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, his comments last week and his announcement to accelerate the investment and the adoption of blockchain in China was not surprising news to hear. And it absolutely is impacting work in Washington, D.C. And I can give you one example of that. While there has been many policymakers and members of Congress that are taking an anti-innovation approach to blockchain, there are many others that understand how important this technology is going to be for our economy, for our national security, and there are efforts underway to promote blockchain innovation and development in the United States of America. One example of that is just last week, the U.S. Department of Commerce hosted a private roundtable with policymakers and blockchain executives to discuss U.S. competitiveness and in blockchain. There is absolutely a concern that we are falling behind. And as you know, at the Chamber, we have been calling on the United States government to have a national action plan for blockchain. And there are efforts underway to move that forward. And some of those conversations were happening as early as last week.
It's good to hear because, you know, just from reporting the sphere, one can argue that that announcement by the Chinese president over the last week was actually a concerted campaign leading to the issuing or the launching of a national digital coin in China, or CDBD, in the next 3 months before 2020. Do you think that will be a game changer also in the United States if that happens?
I think money is changing, monetary policy is changing, the future of finance is changing. Used to, for thousands of years, money was commodities like gold and silver. Since the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, money has mostly been promises from government. And in the future, money is going to be technology. So this concept of a digital dollar and central bank digital currency is something that's absolutely going to impact the way that value is moved around the world going forward. And if we are not at the forefront of that, I do think it could threaten the future of our dominance worldwide.
Amen to that. Let's go back for a minute to the ZEC hearing, because needless to say, love or hate Mark Zuckerberg, I felt, and I'm saying this, I felt it was a bashing that was hard to watch at times. And the lack of understanding, except maybe for McHenry in that televised event, who came to the rescue and raised an issue that goes to the point of why it's important to educate legislators and the public in his opening remarks last week. Let's have a listen.
Other times in history, the use of fear was not so funny. Our last hearing on Libra, for example, was a moment when members of Congress on this dais actually compared that technology of Libra, to the terrorist attacks of September 11th.
Will the gentleman yield?
Look, I have my own
Making
qualms
a
about
reference to
Facebook
nice comment.
and
Will
Libra.
the gentleman yield?
The time belongs to the gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you for taking the bait. Look, I have my qualms about Facebook and Libra. I do. And the shortcomings of big tech. There are many, yes, there are. But if history has taught us anything, it's better to be on the side of American innovation, competition, and most importantly, the freedom to build a better future for all of us.
Perianne Boring joining us, president of the Chamber of Digital Commerce in Washington, D.C. Needless to say, that was one of those moments in the hearing where you understand there is an understanding of the importance of moving forward and not describing maybe the cryptos as funny money or blockchain as something dangerous. Let's go back to, though, you said, the hearing was just one part of something that happened last week, but also it was FinTech Week in D.C. last week. It kind of got lost because I think when we see Mark Zuckerberg on camera, that's all we cover. But tell us, the CFTC, the Sandbox that was decided upon, what are the things that you feel were achieved last week, other than that hearing?
Yeah, beyond the Zuckerberg hearing, last week was DC FinTech Week. There were a lot of activities going on. The Commodity Futures Trading Commission held their annual FinTech conference. And one of the announcements that came out of that is the CFTC, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, have all joined the Global Financial Innovation Network, or GFIN. GFIN is this international sandbox that was started by the UK Financial Conduct Authority. I do think this is a very positive signal for international regulatory interoperability, to have our regulators working together on regulatory matters, how we're going to bring these new technology developments to market. It's great that they have a platform to communicate and to work together, and I do think that will bring some consistency across regulatory requirements worldwide. Also, another announcement out of the CFTC's conference last week, the CEO of BACT, the Bitcoin exchange owned by ICE, announced they'll be launching Bitcoin options on November 9th. So it's also great news to see this maturity in the crypto and the virtual currency markets, and that we will have new regulated products coming out before the end of the year.
And those are all very positive things, but as you mentioned, the Zuckerberg hearing took over. For somebody who's been lobbying and understands the importance of moving legislation, regulation into this new field, do you think that hearing made your life easier or harder?
So there were several pieces of legislation that were discussed at the hearing that does add additional workload to us here at the Chamber, and certainly is raising some concerns. One that I will just mention, and if you go to the hearing page, there's 5 pieces of legislation there. One is called Keep Big Finance Out of, or I'm sorry, Keep Big Tech Out of Finance Act, which would ban companies like Facebook and other technology companies from innovating in the financial services sector, very much taking an anti-innovation approach, and something that is to be concerned about, because as I mentioned earlier, money is technology, and if we don't have technology companies innovating in financial services, it really could impact innovation in the financial services sector, which could impact our global standing on the world stage, and we should constantly be striving for better and for more. So those types of legislation is concerning. And one other one I'll just mention is the Stablecoins Are Securities Act of 2019, which would deem managed stablecoins as securities. We do understand that the House Financial Services Committee is very interested in moving that bill. So that is one that we are looking at more closely, also getting input from our members on how it could impact companies that are innovating in this space, and making sure, as Congressman Emmer noted during the hearing, that we are not banning something that we do not understand. A lot of the comments that came from members of Congress during the hearing really did emulate that we are scared of virtual currency and blockchain technology because we do not understand it. There's a lot of fear, a lot of skepticism and anxiety towards blockchain. But I think a lot of that fear is more based out of a lack of understanding of how this technology is going to work, understanding the risks, but also importantly, understanding what those opportunities are. And we're starting to see these knee-jerk reactions based out of fear to just ban something without taking the time to fully understand or comprehend how banning something like that could impact our economy. So first, we need to understand what it is we're looking to legislate. Before we just want to ban something. There really needs to be a greater educational push, and we do have a lot of work to do, especially with House Democrats, to making sure that they understand not only the risk, but the benefits that blockchain technology and virtual currencies can bring to our financial system.
I couldn't agree more. And then, then let me ask you this, because it's clear and it's obvious that on the Democratic side, breaking up big tech, or big tech as a big bad wolf, is becoming an election theme. Once again, I'm going to say, how hard does it make the job of people who are lobbying to educate on something, as you mentioned, that that the United States may be left behind on because of the politics of fear?
Yeah, it is. We are coming up on an election year next year. And there are other things happening in our political system here in the United States that are kind of leaking into these conversations around blockchain and crypto. As you are aware, during the last election, where President Trump won, there was inquiries about election interference, and Facebook being at the center of that conversation. Yep. Democrats control the House and Congress, so they're the ones who set the agenda and the hearings. And Facebook is not on the best of terms with the Democratic Party at this given moment in our election cycle, which is why I believe you're seeing a lot of more political type conversation happening in these hearings and less on substance. I do think they have real concerns about investor protections and consumer protections, and we need to be talking about those issues. But you can absolutely see how just the general politics happening in Washington are making its way into these important conversations, which is why it's so important that we have professionals working in Washington helping serve as resources to our policymakers, so they can truly understand these issues and be a resource to them as they're looking to legislate in this area.
Slightly related, but not entirely. Last week we had a chance also to interview Tom Lee of Fundstrat, who said that an ETF, for example, is years and years away. Would you say that's the same for regulation, legislation for blockchain?
There are significant legislative activities underway around blockchain and cryptocurrencies. So there is highly likely going to be legislation that is passed this session, so this year or next year, around blockchain. On the ETF, that really has a lot more to do with market infrastructure. So these are issues within the virtual currency markets that need to be addressed. But there is a lot of interest and a lot of scrutiny into crypto. And I think Facebook entering the space has certainly elevated these conversations. So I do think it's highly possible that we will see legislation passed this session around Bitcoin, virtual currency, and blockchain.
You do? That you're optimistic actually about that?
I think it's highly likely.
Okay, amen to that. Let me ask you this. You just, before we started shooting, as you said, you had a very, very intense 2 weeks, and I think all of us lost the idea of, FinTech Week in DC. How would you conclude, let's put the hearing aside, what is the highlight for you that was achieved in that, period of time?
So we are starting to see many different points of views come into focus around the conversation around blockchain. Historically, the sentiment has been that of fear, anxiety, and skepticism of things that we do not understand. We are now starting to see many different policymakers come forward and making these very clear positive statements towards innovation in this space. The ranking member, Patrick Mahenry, who you showed earlier, he mentioned during the hearing that we should not forget that innovation is spreading across the world with or without us. And he believed that American innovation was on trial at the hearing. We also had, Congressman Emmer, again, who said we should not be banning things we do not understand. And we also had Senator Rounds, who sent a letter to Anchorage in support of blockchain technology and their initiatives in the Libra Association. So while the news has really focused on these very negative conversations and the risk of blockchain, we are starting to see many different policymakers stand up who are on the complete opposite side of the conversation and who have been very bold supporters and champions for this space. And that has been very encouraging that we're seeing these voices come forward and these leaders come forward to make sure that the United States leads in technical innovation in the blockchain ecosystem.
Entirely. Finally, Perianne, as we conclude, just because you're based there, you actually understand this sphere. Are you optimistic? Do you think Libra will happen?
They're certainly well intended on launching. As Mark Zuckerberg mentioned in his hearing, he said they would not launch until they have the regulatory approval.
Still.
I do think this is quite different than conversations we have had in the past. It has been well accepted that technology leads before regulation. So I do think that's going to be a significant hurdle. But I think they have a lot of significant hurdles to adoption, and I think companies who want to innovate in this space in a responsible way should have the opportunity to do so. And I hope regulators can address the risks that they need to address, but also understand what's at stake. What is the opportunity cost of not getting this right? And as Mark mentioned in his hearing, the risk that he sees is we will see countries like China take the lead, which could serve much bigger challenges to the future of the financial system if it's not U.S. companies who are leading in this space.
We're leading this race entirely. Perianne Boring, always good to speak to you and find out what you guys are up to. Perianne Boring, the president of the Chamber of Digital Commerce in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us today. We were BLOCKTV. We'll be right back. Thank you.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter.